Okay, we're going to continue talking about modern treaties. And obviously, for those of us who were there in between, we watched our documentary. If you don't recall the name, it was Angry Inuk. What's at the back? Let's quiet down.
Did we finish?
We did finish.
Oh.
Correct. Okay. So obviously the film, for those of you paying attention, finished with a stalemate. The Inuit people lost a lot of ground and did not have much of a capacity to overturn the decision made by the EU. And to clarify, it wasn't necessarily that the Inuit were prevented from hunting. They have a treaty right, they have a Canadian right to hunt seal. The problem that the documentary highlights is that the European Union, due to various protesters and activists, decided that they would ban the sale and purchase of seal fur, which then makes life very challenging for Inuit people because obviously everything up there is very expensive. And it certainly helps that the food you eat is also a product that you can sell. Okay. This slide in particular relates to modern treaties dealing with land. The Canadian government historically did not deal with the Indigenous people in British Columbia, nor did they deal with the the Indigenous people in Nunavut. Okay, so there are not treaties signed for these regions. These were done later. As you can see, the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, 1993, the Nisga'a Final Agreement in 2000. These problems did not begin in those years. They are problems that existed before, but took several decades to solve. Please just blow your nose in the hallway, thank you. In particular for the Nisga'a Nation, I think it's on this case, no, we'll stay here. For the Nisga'a Nation, this group in BC, in the mid to late 1900s, so around 1950 to 1980s, and even prior to that, many of them attempted to claim to the government that they had a right to that land based on the the Royal Proclamation, which we learned about earlier in the chapter. What do you think the government's response was when the Nisga'a Nation brought up the issue in court that, hey, Canadian government, you have no right to this land? How do you think the Canadian government responded? Would anyone like to guess? Yes.
They didn't take it very well?
They did not take it very well. Anything specific they might have done? So the Canadian government made it illegal for Indigenous peoples to go to court on land claims. And so they basically said, yeah, if you have a problem with us, we're actually going to make it illegal for you to have a problem with us.
That's dumb in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. We've already chatted a fair bit about the Indian Act. It would be worthwhile to, Google a variety of sources and learn what the Indian Act is all about, what was prescribed to the Indigenous people it governed over, and how it affected and impacted their way of life. Not only their way of life as a culture, but as individuals. I don't think our slideshow goes into much detail. Anyways, the Indian Act lays the foundation for creating reserves and carving out land for Indigenous people to live on and to do more or less as they wish. Although oftentimes it was less than it was more. For example, the Indian Act essentially states that for an Indigenous person to move from one reserve to another, let's say for business, vacation, if you want to go meet someone, marriage, they must seek permission from the government to do so. Many of you probably have family in different provinces. Some of you have probably gone to visit them. Did you ever have to ask the government, hey, can I go to Saskatchewan to see my family? Can I go to Calgary or Banff and Jasper to see the mountains? No. Now, if you go to the United States, you go to America, do you need permission to go there? Not necessarily, not quite. But what do you need? Likely need a passport, right? Proving you're a Canadian citizen. Now, if you're not a Canadian citizen and you have a passport of a different country, but maybe America and that country don't have such a great relationship, you might need a travel visa, which is essentially a document that allows you to travel in a particular country for a certain amount of time. I'm going to read this letter. This is from an Indian agent. So Indian agents were people who were hired and more or less utilized to ensure that the Indian Act was being followed and adhered to. So this is a letter from an Indian agent to Miss Annie Gagnon. Okay, this letter is dated January 30th, 1945. It reads, Dear Madam, I am in receipt of a copy of your letter recently sent to the Indian Affairs Branch, Ottawa, with regard to your status as an Indian. In reply, I wish to inform you that you are not an Indian as defined by the Indian Act. At the time of your marriage to Joseph Gagnon, a white man, any rights you had as an Indian of the Golden Lake Band seized. This is Section 14 of the Indian Act. And you became a white woman. Yours very truly, H.P. Ruddy. So what are your thoughts on that? Yes, go ahead.
That is inappropriate.
It's inappropriate. How's it inappropriate?
Because.
Well, what specifically?
Because just because you're married to someone who's not of the same culture as you doesn't make you part of that culture.
Is that how ethnicity works, grade 9s?
No.
If one of you girls there marries a brown man, are you brown?
No, that's not how it works.
No.
No.
Yeah, if you marry your friend right there, does that make you black all of a sudden?
Yeah.
No.
Clearly. Okay. So, that might lead to a good question of how do you think they understood ethnicity? Or do we even know what ethnicity is? You may conflate the term race with ethnicity. What did you say? Your hair? Heritage. Ethnicity, yeah, heritage can be part of it. So let's say you come from Europe. Your ancestors are Norwegian. That's your ethnicity.
What about that? What about Miguel?
Maybe, well, many people have multiple ethnicities. Okay. So at that time, marriage played a big role in ethnicity. I guess if you were indigenous, or at least their understanding of it. Some might say it has to do with property rights. Historically, some cultures viewed women as property. And so if an indigenous woman decided to marry a white man, he falls under her property. And I guess according to the Indian Act, then she becomes a white woman. To be legally viewed as one potentially, although I don't know if she would have the right to vote in that scenario. But she certainly loses any privileges that she may have had access to as an indigenous woman. So much of what the Canadian government was trying to do early on was to assimilate as many people as they could into what they envisioned as Canada. And if you'd like to call it the Canadian ethnicity. And maybe in some point in Canadian history there was a clear Canadian identity. I would say over the last 20 to 25 years, a lot of that has been eroded. It's not obvious. What does it mean to be Canadian? Is there a particular look to Canadian culture? Are there particular practices? Is there one shared history? Now, an interesting question that maybe Jonathan Pajot might raise, who's the artist behind that image there you're seeing, the second one, not the top one, is if your identity includes everyone and everything, then do you really have an identity? And what does it mean to have an identity? Can you just include everything, or do you have to exclude certain things to have your own unique identity? Another question might be, why would a government attempt to assimilate its people? Do we understand? Well, first of all, do we understand what the word assimilation means? Can you explain what it means? Roughly, it's okay.
Attempt to change a group of people to make them a different culture or do different practices?
Yeah, you are essentially changing behaviors into whatever you have decided. So let's say every classroom, every teacher has their own set of rules, things that they are allowing and not allowing, and this chatting over here will be not allowed very soon. And so once you walk into that classroom, you assimilate into the rules and regulations of that teacher and classroom. It's no different for a country, right? I mean, there aren't very many cultures that openly accept killing people. But when you come to Canada, you assimilate into our culture, which says, no, you do not kill people. And if you do, there's a punishment. Question. Thank you for your patience, by the way.
If you were born in like Canada, but you live in like Mexico, are you Canadian or?
If you are born in Canada, you have Canadian citizenship. You have Canadian passport rights. Now, if you choose to full-time live somewhere else, it's going to impact the way you pay your taxes and certain other expectations, but you still have every right as a Canadian citizen, despite the fact that you live in Mexico. So let's say you were born in Canada, but your mom or dad, one of the parents, is from Mexico. And so your family lives there full-time. Sure, you may not feel Canadian in the sense of if you were raised and grew up in Mexico, you'd feel more like part of the Mexican culture. But that, again, that doesn't remove the fact that your birthplace was Canada. Right? So one thing that a lot of people do, doesn't relate to this slide so much, something that people do is called, we talk about it in a different chapter. I don't know the specific first word, but we'll just refer to it as pregnancy tourism. So I don't know if anyone knows the actual phrase, but some people will go on a vacation when they're 8 or 9 months pregnant, give birth, likely they have the money to do it, give birth in a different country. Now that child has citizenship. So it's a long-term investment to get citizenship. And other countries also, I think in America, if you're flying in a plane passing over America, they may have changed this, but I believe this law existed at some point. If a woman were to give birth mid-flight while flying over America, that child was born in American airspace and is an American citizen.
Where did that come from?
So these two images show, now obviously what you know about Indigenous people will affect how much you agree or disagree with how dramatic the change is, but obviously from what I've learned about Indigenous people, they did not do this. Does anyone know what's going on in this photo, the bottom right?
Farm.
Yeah, they're farming, right? They're cultivating land. They're settling. Or this is not something that indigenous people did. And by no means is it racist or inappropriate to say that. It's just a fact. They're nomadic people, many of them. Nomadic meaning that they did not stay in one place, they constantly moved around. Does anyone know why they moved around? What were they doing? What's that? Hunting. Exactly. Rather than growing their food, many indigenous people preferred to hunt food. Because meat is just wonderful in comparison to plants.
I know, right?
And so if you come from 10 generations, 20 generations, 50 generations of hunting animals, you might find it very easy to walk through the woods and recognize, oh, deer go by this place. So let's keep following a trail, we'll run into the deer eventually. But that would be very difficult, very different. Has anyone ever grown a plant?
Yeah.
Like from a seed?
Yeah.
Okay. So how long did it take for you to see the plant? Whoever said 8 years, you were clearly doing it wrong. Oh, it was a tree. Okay. What kind of tree?
I don't know. I threw it out after.
Wonderful. Was it a tree that was supposed to grow fruit?
No, it was just a random tree that I got created to.
Okay. Yes, over here.
It was a couple months.
A couple months. What were you growing?
I was planting my grandma's garden. I came back a few months later.
Ah, but your grandma must have seen them
Yeah.
earlier.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have an acreage somewhat south of, I think, Millet, and we have a garden
Okay.
there. We usually plant it around the time when summer, late spring, early summer.
Yeah, now is the time to start planting, from my understanding, because you want your plants to be ready by summer. Right. So even on that note, so my parents' garden, I'll take your hand in a moment. Even my parents started gardening a couple years ago. And over the years of planting, first they just did flowers, things that look pretty. And then eventually they started planting actual food items. Always at the back, thank you very much. They learned from people who are more experienced that you're supposed to plant the seeds, a little bit before, like sometime in spring, really. The reason for that is that by the time you have the hot summer months, your plant is already showing. But again, if you went from hunting every day or hunting regularly for your food to growing it, when you put seeds down in a field, it might take several weeks for you to see a plant. And that plant is going to be very small. So like, if you're planting tomatoes, you're not going to see a ripe tomato, something you could actually eat for some time. If you're planting a fruit tree, it might take several years before that tree is mature enough to actually have fruit on it. So that way of life is obviously not going to be very appealing to people who might see an animal walking by and think, oh, we can run it down, kill it, and eat it tonight. And it's going to be very tasty. And it's going to give us a fur that we can use to keep ourselves warm in this terrible climate. And we can process the meat in a way that will have something saved for us for a couple months. So it's going to take a lot of training, education, and changing of way of life to go from nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle to agrarian, static, staying in one spot, growing food lifestyle.
What is it?
So this process in the first blurb there, first note, is called enfranchisement. Enfranchisement refers to the process of gaining the right to vote. And for many indigenous people, until the 1960s, if you wanted to be able to vote, well, then you had to tell the government, I will rescind my rights as an indigenous person to be able to partake in the Canadian society. And what that tells us is that the government very much was giving this message of either you're Canadian, you partake in our society, even though you may not look like many of us or the people in the government at the time, or you're Indigenous. And if you want to be Indigenous, you stay in this piece of land. We govern your movement. If you marry a white person, you're no longer Indigenous. If you want to vote, if you want to partake in our systems, you have to give up your old way of life. Yes.
That is not right at all.
I think people can vary on that opinion, you know.
I don't agree with that.
I don't agree with it. I don't agree with the right, honestly.
It's very wrong.
You disagree with this method. Why is that? What is your disagreement?
Brady is my disagreement.
What?
Well, Braden is not a reference, so what is your argument? So no one has a logical argument for why this is wrong. I'm not, first of all, I just want to say, I'm not saying it's intrinsically wrong. I'm just saying it's a fact of life. It happened.
Everyone has the right to whatever their identity is, and they should be restricted rights because of something that they didn't choose.
How recent do you think that idea is?
More recent?
Like, you know, I would say each and every one of us is very privileged to live in a time where that statement holds true. It's clearly, you know, as little as 60, 70 years ago, 100 years ago, that statement would not have been true, right? And part of the reason for that is that it's actually incredibly challenging to deal with two different groups, and two is a small number. It's a lot bigger than one. Two different groups who have two very different ways of life. It's incredibly challenging, right? Like, let's say you've organized what your beliefs and values are, and you live in the same house as someone on the exact opposite spectrum of all those values. How much conflict do you think would exist?
A lot.
Probably a lot, particularly if one of you is acting a little less civilized than the other in discussion. Now, obviously, living in 2023, you know, that person is unlikely, you or that person are unlikely to kill one another because, you know, you can go to jail because you live in a greater society. But 100 years ago, if you disagreed with someone on every fundamental aspect of your life, it's like, how do you deal with that problem, right? It's not obvious. Nor is it easy. Okay, let's get two of you to move. Let's actually get you two to move because you were giggling the loudest. So you can go to that table. And you can go at that back desk. Actually, you can go where the chair's already pulled out. Yes.
This is just a quick question. How does the act affect Métis people? Because I personally am.
I'm not sure of that answer.
No, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna have to do some own personal research on that then.
Okay, sit down. Please and thank you.
I close the blind. I can't
That's
see
okay.
the board. It's clear.
Let me see how many slides are on the residential schools. Okay, we'll wrap up with this because we've already been going for almost 30 minutes. I had notes on this chapter somewhere. I don't know where they are anymore. Anyways, it's important to understand about this gentleman, Nicholas Davin, the Davin Report. It's important to understand that he was actually sent to America first to go and see what they were doing. And he quite liked their, what did they call them? They weren't called residential schools in America. They were called industrial schools. In America, they were called industrial schools, if I recall correctly. And he quite liked what they were doing, teaching them some basic skills. I think that's where they got the idea of having people live at the school full time. You know, there is a bit of the process, this residential school process, which involves, you know, you take this child away from their home for 8 to 12 months, and you can remold and reshape them into more or less what you would like. Now, whether or not that actually happened, I don't know. I wasn't at these schools. Another important thing to understand about residential schools is that they took place, they existed in a large span of time over several different provinces, meaning it wasn't the same individuals who were operating these schools throughout. Some of these schools were, got to be about 100 years old. Some of those buildings might still exist and be utilized to this day. The reason why I say that is because, well, none of you would know this, but a few years ago we had a different principal at this school. A few years before that, I'm sure there was a different principal. Okay. The reason why I bring that up is as the administrative capacity changes, people are going to have a different way of running things. And so one group of people who runs the school might be a lot worse than a different group of people. It's not clear or obvious to me that every single school is bad and that every single child had a terrible experience. So an indigenous person, their parents could have gone through the same school, had a, half decent time, and their children could have gone to the same school with different people, and who knows, could have been physically or sexually abused because there was a different group of people running it. And as I already mentioned, there were some groups that obviously wanted a degree of education to be provided to their people, right? So again, addressing that image we saw previously, going from hunting your food to growing it, cultivating it, sitting in one spot, is a dramatic shift in lifestyle. It's a dramatic shift in family structure and community structure. Do you think that, what do you think happened when, let's say you have a particular indigenous tribe, the men go out to hunt, they successfully hunt a buffalo. What do you think occurred next, aside from eating it? How do you think that took place? Celebration. And what do celebrations look like? Sure, a lot of partying and dancing. I'm sure they did that. What else do celebrations look like? Let's say this is our tribe. Okay, a bunch of us go out, we hunt, we come back. The animal. So let's say you, who was partying earlier, let's say you successfully killed the animal, and it's a big animal. So when you come home, do you eat it by yourself?
No.
No, because?
In a tribe.
You're in a tribe, so you eat it with everyone. Okay. How many of you eat together? How many of you have dinner together every day? Like as a group of friends? No one, right? Many of you might have dinner with your family. Many of you might have dinner with one or two people, right? Maybe the whole family can't meet. So it's a dramatic shift of life where, when you hunt an animal in a tribe, it is a celebration because, raise your hand, who likes being hungry? Nobody. Who likes having good food? Okay, so if your tribe successfully collects good food, you're going to share it with everyone. So learning how to then shift not only how you get food, but how you live, how you go from maybe a communal setting to a family unit setting. It's very different. For those of you who grew up with a lot of relatives and family and spent a lot of time with them, like for myself in particular, I have a particular aunt and uncle. They're like a second mom and dad for me. And they definitely were when I was growing up. And so having that community as a child, let's say, of having several adults in your life that you look up to and similar to the level of a parent, it's a very dramatic change. And then obviously there's a big gap here, and this slideshow doesn't necessarily look at or address the atrocities that were also committed. And the challenge with that is that when you have no supervision, it's hard to determine what actually is going on. So the Indian agents were it's very unlikely that they were going around making sure that the schools were run properly for the children's sake. It may have been likely that they went around and made sure that the administrators, the teachers, the staff, that they were taken care of. And so when you have little to no supervision, and additionally little to no accountability for your actions and behavior and how people are treated, it can be very easy to then mistreat the people that you're supposed to be caring for. I would like to believe it doesn't happen as often anymore, although, we really don't know much else about what's going on. Okay, we'll wrap up there. Thank you.